Right, we'll start the meeting now formally. Welcome to the 27th meeting of this year of the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee. You should have your Blackberries, etc., if you still possess such a thing, and other phones switched off because they affect the sound system. We have apologies today from Angus MacDonald. And the agenda item 1 is a decision on taking in private whether the item 3, which is the committee's consideration of its approach to the scrutiny of the Scottish Government's draft Scottish Climate Change and Adaptation Programme, should be taken in private. Are we agreed? Thank you. In that case, we will do that. And agenda item 2 is about behaviour change to do with climate change, and it's a roundtable evidence session with stakeholders on climate change and behaviour change to that. And I think it would serve us each well to know from our guests today, who are all welcome, if you could give us at the most a couple of slightly longer sentences, but not too long, to just say what you do, because our members have got some general idea about areas of questions, but I think it would help us focus given the panel that we've been able to assemble today. So good morning all. I'm the convener, Rob Gibson. We'll move round to Mr. Hilliam, who's first. Just introduce yourself.
Okay. Great. I'm Alex Hilliam. I'm a behaviour change specialist from Changeworks, who's an environmental Changeworks is an environmental charity based in Edinburgh, and we've got a location in Inverness as well. I am, as I said, a behaviour change specialist, focus on that. We do a range of research and evaluation projects within Changeworks that I support, but I also support businesses and other organisations out with Changeworks to engage on the behaviour change agenda. And I should say that I'm working with the Scottish Government's team that have been developing the ISM tool to roll that out.
Thank you. And next we've got Jane. Can I introduce herself?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm Jane Baxter, MSP from Scotland and Fife.
And
good morning, I'm Morag Watson. I am the Development Manager for Learning for Sustainability Scotland, which is Scotland's newly established UN Regional Centre of Expertise on Education for Sustainable Development, and we're headquartered next door at Morrie House School of Education. So we're a network organisation of over 160 members, where we bring together academia, government, business and civil society to harness the power of education to help drive sustainability.
Good morning, I'm Claudia Beamish. I represent South Scotland and Shadow Minister for Environment and Climate Change.
Morning, my name is Ross Payton. I'm here in a private capacity really as a businessman. I'm an organic dairy farmer stroke mixed farmer in southwest Scotland, about 800 acres or so. I've been involved in the Scottish Government Focus Farm project with SRUC. I've also been involved with various sector body organisations, Caledonian Organics and the Scottish Organic Milk Producers Group, and I'm very interested in local community land use issues. I've been involved in the community quite heavily in the initiative group in my local village. So.
Richard Lyle, Central Region, MSP.
Hi, I'm Pamela McLean. I'm part of a community interest company called the Surefoot Effect, which aims to help people with values-based change, primarily towards the environment, but also increasingly social justice. We work with a number of different approaches. Two of them are Common Cause, which the Scottish Government has incorporated into its Go Greener initiatives, and Carbon Conversations, which is a psychologically based group work set of sessions that help communities and people in the workplace move toward lower carbon living. We've run 2 courses here of those with the people in the Scottish Parliament corporate body recently.
I'm Nigel Don, I'm the MSP for Angus North and Mearns. I'm Pete Ritchie, I'm Director of Nourish Scotland, which is a non-government organisation. We have about 1,500 people signed up on our website. We're promoting a more sustainable food system for Scotland. One of the things we're doing at the moment, just as an example, is working with the partners in City of Edinburgh on a project called Edible Edinburgh to bring together the council, the NHS, the universities, and people like Zero Waste Scotland to try and drive a more sustainable food system at a city and city region level. And in my other job, I'm an organic farmer in the Borders.
I'm Alex Ferguson, MSP for Galloway and West Dumfries.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Louise MacDonald. My day job is Chief Executive of Young Scot, the National Youth Information and Citizenship Charity for Scotland. We're an organisation for 11 to 26-year-olds across Scotland. But I'm also one of the newly appointed Vice Chairs of the 2020 Climate Group for Scotland. And as part of that have behaviour change and public engagement as part of my remit.
Jim Hume, MSP for South Scotland.
I'm Kerry Riddell and I work for the Conservation Volunteers, which is the UK's largest environmental volunteering charity. And in Scotland, we've been doing quite a lot of work on behaviour change over recent years. Our focus is really on engaging people with the environment and effecting change at a personal and social level. So we've done a number of programmes over the last 3 years involving behavioural change, both working externally, so providing tools to communities to change what happens within their communities. And we've also worked internally, changing our whole organisation using a values approach.
I'm Graham Day, I'm the MSP for Angus South and Deputy Convener of the committee.
Thank you all. I think it would be a good idea to start off just by thinking about the government's approach, and in particular the ISM team and the tool which is being offered to people to measure. So perhaps we could start, Alex, with a little comment or two on that, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ISM tool's been developed by the Scottish Government over a number of years. They did an international review of behaviour change a couple of years ago that reviewed a range of different behaviour change initiatives across the world, and that, I suppose, was the start of the development of what became the ISM tool. ISM is an analytical framework which looks at behaviour change really in 3 broad categories: the individual, the social, and the material. And through that, it uses insights from a range of different academic disciplines, all that have been used to explore and examine and develop behaviour change interventions over the years. And I think its strength is that it takes a holistic approach to behaviour change. It doesn't just look at the individual, targeting an individual and changing an individual. It doesn't just look at the social setting and looking at how that influences change. It doesn't just look at the material level, the policies, the infrastructure, etc. So it's an all-encompassing, holistic approach to behaviour change that I found very useful in terms of understanding and evaluating and designing behaviour change. It encapsulates the whole elements of the different disciplines.
If you want to take part in this discussion, just indicate to me and I'll bring people in due course. Anyone else want to talk about the ISM tool? Yes, Morag Watson.
Thank you. I would echo Alex's comments that from our research background, looking at the research on which both the ISM and the behaviour change framework is based, it is really good to see Scottish Government taking on board what this says. We're very pleased to see the change of rhetoric away from behaviour change and the focus on the individual to culture change and looking at the context in which behaviour takes place. So as I say, we broadly welcome it. The one thing that we are looking for as we move forward with this is what the framework itself says very good, and it has begun to influence policies across government, and where we'd be looking in the future is to see this rolled out across government policy, particularly relating to the RPP.
Okay. Alex Ferguson wants to come in.
Well, I think my sort of query has really just been answered by Morag Watson, because I was just wondering if how other panel members had whether they were aware of this tool, how they found it, how useful they found it, and whether they do believe it forms the right basis as we take this very complex policy area forward.
Louise MacDonald.
Absolutely. I think also have, through work with 2020 Group and other areas, this is very, very welcome in terms of that kind of new approach, and also because it isn't just taking a kind of isolated model, it is taking that whole view. So it's extremely welcome, and have participated in sessions, seen how it worked. At 2020 group level, we are now exploring how we can use that with businesses across Scotland. So I've actually got an active piece of work being discussed just now with the transport group of 2020, looking at employees and transport with businesses in Scotland and using the ISM tool to help businesses really make that that leap into the kind of the very obvious kind of traditional models and take a deeper look at how to really affect these issues. So I think we can see where it can actually be used in a wide variety of different places.
Pete Ritchie.
Just say, to echo that from Nourish Scotland, we're very keen to see people eat more fruit and vegetables. They've got a lower carbon footprint and they're better for our health. We don't eat enough in Scotland. People on low incomes eat 15 to 20% less fruit and vegetables than they did in 2007, and they weren't eating enough then. And the reason they're eating less vegetables is because they're expensive compared to highly processed foods which aren't particularly good for their health but are a better source of calories. So it makes no sense to have a framework of behaviour change which is about exhorting people on low incomes to eat more fruit and vegetables. And if they want to cook those vegetables, they then have to turn the cooker on. And if they're living in fuel poverty, they're not able to do that. So we welcome this idea that we need to move away from some idea that all we need to do is tell people. It's not that people on low incomes don't know that they should be eating fruit and vegetables. We've got that message across. But telling them again isn't what's needed. It's changing the material circumstances and the social networks and supports which allow them to do that. And it's not just people on low incomes, it's all of us. But, for example, we don't have in the food system the equivalent of cycle lanes. We don't have the beginnings of cycle lanes. What we've got is an asocial food system where increasingly what you expect to do is buy food as an individual for an individual and to cook it as an individual for an individual meal. And we've actually taken the social nature out of the food system, and we're not going to change the food system. We'll get the social factors back in along with the material factors, which are getting, for example, healthy food to people at affordable prices. For a primary producer, if you get 25% of the till cost, you know, the retail cost of vegetables and fruit, you're doing very well, right? So 25% is what the primary producer gets. That's good. So there's a huge margin to be made there on getting fruit and vegetables grown in Scotland, grown sustainably in Scotland, using organic methods to people at affordable prices. So if we could look at the whole framework, that would be very helpful.
Jim Hume indicated on this point, I guess.
It was talking about perhaps motivation. I don't know if that's moving the point on, what perhaps motivates or...
It may well move the point on. Was it on this point? We'll try and bring you in a minute.
Surely.
Yeah. Pamela McLean.
Yes, on that point, and then picking up from what several people have said about the holistic approach that the ISM fosters, we need to look beyond the individual. Collective action is going to help people. If people feel that they're outliers, that they're doing this by themselves, they're less likely to take a step forward to make a change. Equally, the 10 behaviors, you know, the 2020 Climate Group is looking at transport, Pete's Nourish organization is looking at food. We need to draw all these things together for people so that they see that it's a new lifestyle, not just, I need to make this one simple change. If we leave it there, we fall into the same trap, if you will, that we've already seen with recycling. How many people out there think that they're doing recycling and therefore it will all be okay? So again, holistic approach.
Well, Jim developed the point now.
I think it does sort of lead on development. I think it'd be quite interesting to hear from, well, you're all at the coalface, but somebody on the ground, Ross down in the stewardry, regarding motivation for behavioural change, what his feelings and other feelings are, what motivates someone like yourself to change from normal practices in farming to different practices. Is it the feel-good factor, just want to do good for the earth, or is it hoping for economic benefits, and how we can sort of spread that cultural change outwards?
I think there's inevitably an economic imperative to use less energy, for example. For me, there's also a feel-good factor. I enjoy farming organically, for instance. It's challenging. It's supposedly better for the environment. Some people would argue with that. There's certainly... community involvement is quite important. quite enjoy having a close contact with the local community, and it's good to see there've been various things happening around about where people have got access to land themselves and started doing things on their own wee plots in the village and in a bigger scale in some cases. But in terms of my industry, the motivation has got to be to see that it benefits their own businesses. I mean, there's no doubt about it. We might have high ideals, but farmers will change when they see a benefit. And there's all sorts of things we learned as part of the Focus Farm group that didn't involve windmills and solar panels. It was all to do with greater efficiency, and I say that as an organic farmer because the word efficiency sometimes makes people think, oh God, we've got to talk about GMOs and more fertiliser, but it's actually better use of the resources you've got, trying not to damage your soil structure, for instance, trying to make use of animal manures instead of artificial fertilisers, because there's huge knock-on effects from misuse of your own resources or wasting your own resources on the environment, because it takes more energy to do things badly, if you like. And it does, you know, it's difficult in bad weather. It's doing carbon footprints is tricky because other things throw a span on the works all the time, like the weather. But I certainly think that for what I've seen, the emphasis should be on greater efficiency and not wasting resources, and that maybe comes back to what Pete was saying in terms of, in a wider context, maybe not using such intensive farming systems and maybe eating less meat. I mean, a lot of farmers throw up their hands in horror at the vegetarian argument, oh, we eat far too much meat, but I think it's probably inarguable to a fair extent that globally we eat too much meat, and we need a better balance, you know. But I'm really interested in this idea of poverty and whatnot, because I think, you know, the idea of poverty causing people to eat badly, it's a poverty of the spirit. It's people are depressed, basically, and they don't care about their health because they're depressed because they're in poverty. You know, it all feeds into each other. They're not going to listen to people saying it's better for your health, you know, if they're basically, you know, completely floored, not really caring one way or another. That's why people smoke, drink too much. You know,
I can understand the strength of your feeling here. I think we share that and try to explore it. We've got 2 or 3 people come in. Graham wants to add a...
Yeah, if I may just take up Ross's response to Jim Hume's question. In looking to bring about individual behavioural change and cultural change, what is the most effective message? Is it one that simply says you should do this to save the planet, or the one that says if you do this you'll save yourself money, it will be better for your health, and you'll contribute to helping save the planet? What's the best approach in your experience?
It's very, very difficult to nail it down because everybody's different. Everybody's motivated by different things. You know, people that say they don't care about climate change, quite possibly they don't care about climate change because it's such a kind of nebulous idea in some ways. People do certainly feel things in their wallet, which is why in some ways the best incentive to reduce your energy use is a big energy bill.
So Pete Ritchie first and then Morag Watson.
Okay, just backing up what Ross is saying, part of the shift to make...
Let's go on.
You know, organic farming doesn't put reactive nitrogen onto the ground. The costs of cleaning up reactive nitrogen in Europe are higher than the benefits, the economic benefits, but it's not on the balance sheet. Similarly, biodiversity is higher on organic farms, that's not on the balance sheet. And carbon sequestration in organic soils is something like 28% higher than in non-organic soils, but again, that doesn't appear on anybody's balance sheet. So part of the difficulty is, unless we have the sort of natural capital accounting that SNH is starting to look at, it's going to be very hard to see where the gains are to society from those private initiatives that people like Ross are making to invest in organic farming. So there's gains to society, but they're not necessarily reflected in his bottom line, and that's an economic problem. And I just wanted to add to that, we've got to always accompany messages about it would be good to do this, it would be good to do that, with 2 other things. Facilitative measures that make it easier. Cycle lanes was the example I gave earlier. Home insulation is another example. We need to find ways of making it easier for people to do the right thing. But we also need to rely very much on what Pamela was saying about social norms. We need to create new social norms. We live in a herd, we're a herd animal, and what our neighbours and our communities and our families do makes a difference to what we think is the right thing to do, and we have to make low carbon living the normal thing to do, not the weird thing to do.
Okay, Morag Watson.
I was just going to pick up on Jim and Graham's questions around motivation and messages, and from the work that we've done both in Common Cause and in Natural Change, which I've worked with Lou on, is the motivation is complicated, is the simple answer, and people's motivations for doing different things from what they say, or actually if they start to unpick why they did something, is quite different. I'm going to slightly disagree with Ross on this one, and Pete around the money issue. I've brought this up in this committee before, that money actually is not a particularly big motivator of people. In business, it is an important consideration, but I would maybe challenge my two farming friends here. If they were truly motivated by money, they wouldn't be farmers, they would be merchant bankers. And as a farmer, there are things that you care about a great deal: the soil of which you are a steward, the people who work for you, the fact that the farm may have been in your family for a long time. And these, again, are powerful motivators that keep you involved in what you're doing. Just to pick up on your question, Graham, about is there one message? And what we are finding from the research is, no, there isn't a message. We've been searching for this elusive magic wand of there's something that you can say that will change people's minds. And what we have found, and Pam can expand on this, is it's a conversation. When people are given the time and space to actually talk through why they do certain things, it begins to come to the fore. And to give you an example of how powerful this can be, I have a colleague who works with people who are in high finance in the City of London, because most of the investment for environmentally damaging major infrastructure projects goes through the City of London. And even these people who have salaries that would make your eyes water, when given the space, the motivations come out to do with community, cooperation, family, and so on, when you might be led to believe that these people care about nothing but money and their own status. That just is not the way human beings are wired. And this whole agenda is about actually looking at these other motivations and beginning to look at how we can operationalize them and bring together these much more powerful things than people's commitment to money to make a big cultural shift.
Before we get back to Ross, we will get back to you. There's several people want to come in. Pamela McLean, Claudia Beamish, if it's on the point, that before we move on to another one, Kerry Riddell, Alex Hilliam and Louise MacDonald. So we've got a round of people before we get back to you, Ross. So, you can sit back and enjoy. So first of all, Pamela McLean.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to chip in about motivation, and just as Morag had said, time and space, I just started writing that down. And in terms of motivation, what we have found to be the longest lasting and most prolonged change comes from working toward the community good. And, Ross said something around this, enjoyed working with his community. This is what Morag is saying about these sorts of values. At the base of it, override people's need for money. And what we found in Carbon Conversations, just as one example, is that people start to reprioritize how they spend what money they have once they have considered this common good, and once they realize there are other people willing to go in that direction. So
it's not an individual thing, it's a collective thing in that sense. To Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Convener. I'm interested in pursuing the collective vision a little bit further in view of the conversation we're all having here today. In our report on the framework to the Scottish Government at the start of this, one of our recommendations was how all sections of society, including those on low incomes, can play a vital part in creating the level of culture and behaviour change required, which sort of follows from Ross's point and others. Both yourself, Ross, and Pete have either mentioned or are involved with community models. And yourself, Pete, for those that don't know, I'm sure you can say it better than I, but Richard Lockhead was at the opening of the first community share option for a community buyout of a farm. And I wonder the degree to which actual ownership matters in terms of communities in relation to this issue that we're talking about today, or whether it's about involvement. And if it's not ownership, how do we involve people better in urban as well as rural areas? There are so many initiatives in relation to empty land in urban areas as well. And I wonder if we can just put that into the mix, please.
Well, we need to try and incorporate these questions from Claudia into some of the answers at the moment to the slightly earlier point, but if you can, you're all genii or something. Kerry Riddell first.
Just to come back to the question about what is the key thing that gets people to change their behaviour, and to build really on Pam and Morag's contributions, our experience is that there are two things. One is providing tools for community leaders, so making it easy for people to understand how they need to use an appropriate message and deal with particular people in a different way. And the other thing is providing opportunities for citizenship. And this is really varied and something that the environmental sector does really well. We've just had some really interesting research done with Edinburgh University in which it was showed that volunteers came to us with largely self-directional values as their motivation. They wanted to get a job or increase their prospects, but actually having volunteered with us, as a result of that volunteering experience, they ended up with universal values, and they were much more keen on working to affect climate change and deal with environmental damage too. So that's really interesting. We've also, in the process of doing some research in partnership with SE Web, which has been looking at citizen science. And again, we're seeing that there's something like 60% of people are saying that they are motivated to work more closely with their communities and that they have carried out more environmental action as a result of participating in citizen science. So all of this is around creating space and time for people to participate in citizenship and watching that change happen as a result of that. And it's also about exemplification and exemplifying those intrinsic and positive values that are going to lead to that kind of change in the long run.
Thank you. Answers will no doubt develop as we move along. So Alex first and then Louise.
Yes. Thank you. I think we've covered many of the things that I wanted to say, and I think it's that elusive. Sorry?
We can't.
No. I just well, yeah. I think it's the looking for the magic bullet. If that's the right word. Looking for the one solution, the one way to get people to change behaviour is a huge challenge. Part of the work that ChangeWorks does is we operate two of the Home Energy Scotland, as they now are, advice centres that the Energy Saving Trust operate in Scotland, which is engaging with the public via community events, via the telephone, via the internet. And there's lots of different messages that have attracted people to use the Home Energy Scotland centres. Some of them have been financially based, which in terms of saving money on your home, saving money on your energy bills. Others have been focused on making your home more cosy, supporting your family to have a warm environment, just basically to get people to install insulation. There's a lot of different messages that have given people, that have attracted different people at different times to embrace that change to install insulation or to make behavioural changes in the home. I think one of the interesting things that relates to what many of the people have been saying in here, I've actually undertaken some training for some of the advisors, and when advisors have managed to engage householders with the topic and actually talk to them a little bit more and share some information about some of the other wider kind of greener behaviours that come under the Greener Scotland banner, that kind of normalising, demonstrating that other people do these sort of behaviours, not strong, not deep, these are very light touch engagements, but actually just that little bit of engagement can be very effective, and we can take people on that journey from maybe initially getting interested because of some kind of financial saving to a wider interest around maybe common values and so on. So I think there's a multiple set of routes, but there's multiple ways in.
To just get to the final two in this little section, Louise MacDonald.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I suppose a couple of kind of things spring to mind. I think a similar point in that I think looking for one single answer is just really going to frustrate us, really, if we try to just find one single answer. I think, the search for the rational man is a futile one. There is no such thing, and I think so we have to kind of accept that we are or women, absolutely, that we are complex kind of beings. So I think that's important. But I think the one thing to say is actually some of this stuff on behaviour change, we actually know quite a lot. It's just about actually putting it into practice. And that seems to be some of the issues. So organisations like Futerra, which some of you may have heard of, who are a specialist agency in communications around climate change, they for quite some time have had a kind of a standard list of kind of golden rules around how you communicate around this. But actually it's the implementation, and I suppose to come back to the ISM gives us a way for policymakers and others to actually implement that. The one thing I would say is, though, I think we cannot underestimate it comes down to values. And I can give kind of just a couple of quick examples. I'll give you my own example. The reason I'm here is because I was challenged on my own values about this issue 4 years ago through a WWF programme called Natural Change, where it sought to take leaders, people with kind of influence who weren't involved in this agenda at all, and say, start to think about it, start to think about sustainability and some of these issues. And part of that was giving time and space to actually reflect on that. Now, I am happy to admit, and I'm on record as saying this, prior to taking part, my idea of the great outdoors was the space between the taxi cab and the front door of Harvey Nichols. That was the great outdoors. But actually now, going through that process, having time to think about my values and so on personally, I was doing recycling, but I was doing it because that's what good citizens do. I wasn't doing it because I cared. And now I've made significant changes to my own lifestyle, but also in my work, and committed to this work because of having that time and space to consider it. So values are powerful. I can, vouch for that. But also we found that in our work with young people. We've just recently at Young Scots surveyed nearly 500 young people, aged 12 to 22, around these issues, specifically looking at common cause and values in the ISM tool. And what we found is that actually you might expect young people to be scoring high in terms of values around hedonism and stimulation and those sorts of things. They don't. Where young people score high is security, family, and benevolence, community, doing good. And actually, this is this thing about us being kind of human. And young people are kind of saying, these things are important, we recognise these issues are important, but the first things they're talking about is education, is family, is poverty. And those things that are happening, those are the things they're seeing day in and day in and out that they care about. My last point comes to Claudia's point on community, Claudia, is that I think when I hear that from young people, that kind of really gives me a sort of sense that this is something that we can build from and actually work from. It doesn't kind of allow us to escape our responsibilities as adults, to be taking responsibility for what we've created, and so on. But actually working with young people and that sense of community is possible. And the recent Climate Challenge Fund refresh, and I'm on the grants panel for that, the refresh of that, focusing on community, is really important, and we're starting to see some really interesting stuff coming through in the Climate Change Fund. Things around different communities, harder to reach communities, minority ethnic communities, and also more recently an interest around issues of fuel poverty as well. So I think that's one to watch with interest as those programmes develop and where they go.
Quite a lot of food for thought there. Ross, you wanted to come back a little.
All I wanted to say with this talk about whether we're motivated by money or not. I mean, you're right, we're not farming to make money, but you have to make money in order to continue farming. And one of the things that helps in any business, if you're making a sufficient profit, that you can step back a bit and say, I would like to invest in something like renewables. Whereas if you're kind of up against it all the time, there's a tendency just to have your nose down and your backside up all the time, and not really think about it. But I mean, I have to disagree. Money does help a bit. I mean, the brutal sledgehammer approach of the feed-in tariff has seen a hell of a lot of windmills going up in farms, hasn't it, Alex, locally? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing at all. It introduces farmers to the concept of renewables, and they're not as controversial as the giant wind farm projects. And I think if that introduces farmers to renewables, feed-in tariffs have worked quite well, and the renewable heat incentive probably has the same effect. So there is an element of which the blunderbuss approach of grants and stuffing their mouth with gold to some extent, it does have an effect.
We're going to try and, we've got a lot of other points to make. Dick Lyle wanted to ask a question just now.
Well, it's basically on that point, and let's be honest about it, it's generation change. The generation before me fought in the war, Second World War, not the Boer War, and weren't what they called squander bugs. In the 60s, when it came on, people just, everything was getting better, and people just misused energy, etc., etc. But, you know, the point I have to come down is that it's basically bringing our children up right. My children never threw litter in the street, because I abhor people who used to drive by in cars and throw the litter out of cars and whatever. So every time my kids were eating a sweetie or whatever, they would give me the paper to put in my pocket to dispose of it in a litter bin. So it's training, and not in the extreme training, but basically showing people that they can do better, showing people that if you put the light out, you can save energy and reduce your costs, showing people how to cook. You know, you've got, within schools, and you know, let's be honest about it, at this moment in time, we have a lot of schools and a lot of kids who are into this eco-warrior, basically getting the green flag, eco flag for the school. And I think it's generation change. And I think if we teach our children and our grandchildren how to not to misuse energy, how to cook right, how to feed right, how to, you know, to make that difference, I think that we've seen a tremendous amount of recycling increase in the last 5-10 years because of that. Maybe there's not a particular one advert, but I think it's the bringing your children up right through schools and through parents in order to ensure that they make that change and they buy into all the different things that every organisation sitting around this table is saying today.
I wonder if, in fact, what Louise MacDonald said about people being confronted about their behaviour in some non-confrontational way, some inclusive sort of way, is something that we could take out of what Dick has just said. But I think we can take the points forward in people's answers to the next part. But Alex, followed by Morag, followed by Pete.
It was just really to pick up on something that Ross said in relation to, you know, the feed-in tariffs coming in to encourage people to install renewables. We're doing some work at the moment in one of the projects that I'm working on in relation to solar panels for households in social housing settings. And this, I think, encapsulates kind of the ISM, but it also encapsulates why you need to take a holistic approach to behaviour change. So there's a range of housing associations that have installed solar panels, and there's a range of kind of material drivers for that. Feed-in tariffs, Scottish Housing Quality Standards, the fuel poverty agenda, trying to assist people to get out of fuel poverty. Fundamentally, the housing associations wanted to put solar panels on people's homes so that they could save money by giving them free electricity. The FITS was an added incentive. What we found, the research isn't finished, what we found is that people, as others have highlighted, don't actually have the knowledge, the skills to understand how the panels work, how to use them. They don't know really necessarily how they work, what the best behaviours to pick up on are. And I think what these settings have kind of lacked is a bit of social norming. There's not been much focus on the social factors, in getting people to talk about how they use their solar panels, getting people to engage with the renewable energy, and also there's not been enough kind of individual targeted skills, upskilling and giving people that know-how. And I think it's a classic example of how the government can introduce things such as FITS, such as Housing Quality Standard, and fuel poverty agenda and so on. But if you've not got the other holistic view of how to deliver behaviour change for these people, it's not going to happen. So I think it's just, I don't know whether that pulled everything together or not, but I think it's an important perspective because we just can't rely on policies by themselves.
You make a major point about capacity building, which is something that I have been stressing in a lot of areas because people have got quite a bit of money in individual and community settings now from renewable energy, community benefit even, or even ownership of parts of those. So it's something which we'll put to, you know, something to very much bear in mind about bringing about the behaviour change. I agree. We asked in terms of land reform how communities would cope with community ownership, and the capacity building aspects of that are exactly the same. They are the bit that's perhaps most important from my point of view of seeing a change there. And interestingly, when you see successful community land activities like in North Harris, which has been well written up by Fiona Mackenzie in her book Places of Possibility, you see people engaging in the ways that they can rebalance their lives related to nature, but also in terms of using the resources in a more carbon sensitive way. So there are good examples indeed of people who are relatively poor, but have a collective ability, calling on these kinds of bits of advice to help them make a change. I know that's a big statement, but I thought I would throw it in at the moment in case people want to come back to say anything about it, but since I'm the only Highland member here, I think it's an important point to make.
Could I just add to that, because I think it is an important point to make, and I can't help feeling that this whole conversation sort of is starting to focus on one of the difficulties that I see in all of this agenda, because this sort of thing is not, it's radical and it's innovative, but it's not that difficult to roll out in a small rural area. If all of these policies and intentions are to have the effect that they need to have, then it's got to be rolled out in the middle of Glasgow, in the middle of Edinburgh, in the middle of Dumfries, in the places where Pete was referring to originally, where people can't afford to turn on the cooker to eat better, and all of these social problems come into effect. And what I haven't yet, and I think money does come into it on an individual basis. You know, everybody lives in their own economic environment. And while, yes, we'd all probably love to be, well, we'd all love the income of merchant bankers, I'm quite sure, though I'm not sure I fancy the lifestyle very much. As a former farmer, I'll stick with Ross on that one. Money does come into this, and it has a huge role to play, I think, because if you can afford to do all these things, it's quite easy. So my question, and I'm sorry about this ramble, is how do we translate this into those surroundings and those environments where it's going to have the most effect, and indeed the effect that is most needed, if this isn't just going to become somebody that frankly benefits those of us that can afford it.
So carrying on from there, Morag Watson,
I
incorporating that.
Maybe just make it clear, when I say that money is not the most important motivator, money is important, yes, we all have to live within our means, so just to clear that one up, but just to reiterate, it is not the most important motivator for most people. But picking up on Richard's point, and Claudia's and Alex's as well, making sweeping statements, when it comes to educating our young people in sustainability, I can safely say Scotland leads the world. I'm currently doing work with UNESCO, looking at this around the world. I recently met in Beijing with a group of international colleagues, and quite frankly, their jaws hit the floor when they hear what we have done in Scotland. And some of it can actually be attributed to the natural change. We have changed the professional standards for our teachers in Scotland. They come into effect this August. And it now clearly says, as a teacher in Scotland, you have 3 responsibilities. One is to your professional values of caring for children and social justice and so on, as we would expect. One is learning for sustainability, which you must push forward in everything you do to discharge your professional duties. And one is leadership of your own profession, of how we develop our profession to do this. Last year, a group of people were on an advisory group to Dr. Alistair Allen. They made 31 recommendations about how we reorientate our schools system in Scotland to put sustainability at the heart of it. Dr. Allen accepted those in March this year, and in October, implementation group will be set up. Learning for Sustainability Scotland will be involved in the Secretariat, and we are working with the General Teaching Council, rolling out training across training institutions in Scotland and all of Scotland's 53,000 teachers. So, you know, we're doing really well on this, but as Louise can reiterate, when you work with young people, they have a mental category which is what adults say and then the stupid things that they do. And, you know, every young person is told about drinking and drugs, and then they look on a Friday and Saturday night at what they see around them and go, this is a stupid thing that adults do, but they tell us not to. And likewise, climate change action fits into that category. They tell us one thing, but, you know, we're 8 years old, we have no power and no money, and here you are as the Scottish Parliament, who they perceive to be extremely powerful, and they're asking, why aren't you doing it when you're the people in charge? So it's an interesting dynamic there. So it's a double-edged sword that, as someone who's committed my life to the education of young people, I'm right with you on educating young people is important, but with the caveat, please do not put the responsibility on the 8-year-olds to solve the world's problems. Picking up on what Alex said about how do you take this into an urban environment, one of the key things that we've put into the changes in education is that a school is not doing sustainability if they are not working in partnership with their own community. And we have seen very powerful change happen this way, particularly around picking up on Claudia's comment about ownership. Many young people, particularly in urban environments, feel entirely rejected by their own community. They are the unwelcome youth who gathers on street corners and we want rid of them. They don't feel part of it. Through this kind of work, and this is a core part of learning for sustainability, is the feeling of belonging, of being part, of cooperating, of working in partnership with others. And I'm sure Kerry can also give examples of this. That when young people feel they belong, when they feel that they are part of the community, that they are respected and their views are taken on board, when they're doing intergenerational learning and learning that, listen to young people, they know cool stuff. Listen to old people, they know cool stuff. And they work together, we see some very powerful changes. And I wouldn't advocate that education is the only way that we should be doing this. There are other measures to be taken in urban environments, such as urban farming and community ownership and so on. But it is one of the levers that we have as a government, as a society at our disposal. And it is one we are starting to use quite well. And I look forward in coming years to seeing it being used much more effectively.
Pete, Kerry and Jane Baxter.
I'll take up where Morag left off. Young people don't have the checkbooks yet, and we haven't got 20 years to wait until they do have them. So we've got to make it easier for people to do the right thing. And
checkbooks.
Well, everybody has some spending power. However much spending power they have, we need to make it easier to do the right thing. Young people have the least spending power of all. The gap between what we say we'd like to do and what we do is significant, and that's why this is a three-part framework. It's about social and material, and we just need to not focus on the individual stuff here. It's great people make individual changes. We need to make it easier for more people to make individual changes. So 30% of people in Scotland say they'd like to buy local food. The local food market is under 1%. People in Scotland love birds. Loads of people join the RSPB. More birds on organic farmland. Farmland birds is a key performance indicator for Scottish Government. People who love birds don't buy organic food. We're not, because we're not getting that organic food to market, and the organic supply chains aren't working. So we need to look at the social material things. As I said before, we need the cycle lanes. We need the building standards. Insulation standards have gone up because of building standards, not because builders thought it was a good thing to do, not because they made the individual change to build better houses. And people can't buy electric vehicles if there's no charging points. But what we're asking people to do often is buy an electric vehicle. Sorry, there's no charging points, but be committed to having an electric vehicle. So we do need to change the material contract. And Claudius said about collective action. I think we've got a number of collective structures in Scotland we can use much more effectively. Credit unions are a good example. Credit unions are well established in Scotland. They're a vehicle through which people on low incomes can pool their resources, buy things in scale, which they otherwise couldn't do individually, and drive collective action. And so many things like unpacking the electricity market we've been hearing a lot about lately. If you start getting into cities retailing electricity, you can have city councils actually using electricity in a much more creative way, so that they could, instead of what we do at the moment, is penalise people their first few units of electricity, they could make those cheaper, and they could start penalising people for their greater use of electricity. They could actually change the way that they use electricity to drive this sort of change, but it would mean city councils actually taking on retailing electricity. It's not impossible, they've done it before, but we need to think at that sort of scale, and Nourish is working with Scottish Communities Alliance and a number of other community sector organisations to look at this whole idea of community scale infrastructure as the missing link in driving this sort of change. So at the moment we're talking about how to use structural funds. We've got a proposal up with the government, how to use structural funds for things like decentralised grids, for things like community buying groups at scale to link communities to farmers. So there's lots of possibilities, but we need to upscale our thinking.
That's a big checklist. Next we've got Kerry Riddell.
Just going back to Alex's kind of question about how we develop community capacity and get people to do things in the urban context, it occurs to me that we are already affecting change in communities across Scotland, but not necessarily this kind of behaviour change. And I think it's really important for us to look at the statutory CLD sector, to look at NGOs working within the community context, and to think about the change that they are already making happen on a personal and social level, and how we integrate what we want to do with carbon reduction into that change. And that is the beauty of the values approach, I think, because when you're thinking about the values approach, it hits all sorts of targets, and it enables us to be able to change outputs around learning, around young people, around older people, around security, around community capacity building, all sorts of things, as well as being able to achieve carbon reduction. So in my mind, there is some kind of need to facilitate and upskill all of those people who are already achieving change in the community sector and the environmental volunteering sector to be able to make sure that they facilitate that collective action effectively that achieves bigger carbon reduction behaviour change.
Jane Baxter wanted to.
Thanks, Convener. It's a wee bit of a contribution, but it's also a question. I think that one of the most significant collective mechanisms that we've got in Scotland for implementing any kind of change would be local government. And I speak as somebody who's a councillor in Fife, I should just perhaps say that. Pete was talking about things like credit unions and turbine development. In Fife, the council's developing those things and supporting those things. And one of the big things that I've seen happen in Fife is the move to introduce doorstep recycling. Now that's a big, big thing for the council because it saves the council landfill tax, it saves the council a lot of money on operating lorries, it's a big carbon footprint issue for the council, but very, very difficult to roll out, to get back to Alex's point about how do you do these things on a mass scale. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of doorsteps, and people don't like having 4 bins. You try to engage with them, you spend hours and hours at community councils, leaflets, information, a huge communication and engagement exercise that probably other councils are doing. So my question is to people around the table, what's their experience and involvement of working with local government, and do they see that those local government as having a role to play in taking these matters forward?
We've got a number of people before we get to you, Louise. So, Alex, Helium, Anno and Pamela McLean, and then Louise MacDonald.
Yes, great, thank you. Well, we're obviously in tune, because the example that I was going to bring to Alex's comment about how do we translate this to Glasgow was to actually look at domestic household recycling. I mean, if you were to look at the situation maybe 30 years ago and to look forward and say, well, actually, here we are in 2013, we've got food waste recycling, we've got cardboard recycling, we've got plastic recycling, we've got garden recycling, we've got, you know, and general waste collections are only, I don't know what it's like in Fife, but in Edinburgh it's certainly 2 weekly for those with individual bins. And that's a massive, massive change. And people have accepted, well, not everybody's accepted that, and there's been tensions along the way. But I think we can look for using, I'm going to talk about the ISM framework again, but using the ISM framework, we can understand why that's worked. And it's not just about legislation and taxation, but obviously there's an obligation on local government to pay landfill tax, so that's a driver for them to implement these things. There is some sense of individual messaging that's been happening through the years in relation to people contributing to recycling and not wasting. There's been elements of communities, certainly Changeworks has been a part of community-based engagement on doorsteps to kind of get people, to encourage people to reduce their waste. There's norms. There's people who've been seeing people changing their behaviour. People have been seeing people putting their nice red bins out on a Thursday morning or whatever it is. And if you see that, you do it automatically. You think it's part of your civic duty or it's part of what you just do. There's infrastructure changes around that and different collection routes, changing the collection routes. There's schedules. People have different, people are given information on the schedules of recycling and what to do, and they change. Obviously, they change it from single weekly recycling for the single collection for general waste to 2 weekly collection for general waste. Now that's a huge, complicated mix of things that's made this possible. And it's not, and you couldn't have introduced that probably overnight in 1975 or whenever the agenda started. I don't know exactly when it was. But actually, I think that just shows, one, that it's not easy to translate these ideas, but I think to any setting. But two, I think if you look at it in the round, and the ISM is a good tool to do this, you can start to explore the avenues and the barriers and the opportunities to actually deliver that change. There is no one solution, but actually having a tool such as the ISM to analyse a particular behaviour at a particular time enables you to highlight all those range of different things. What legislation do we need? What information do householders need? What changes in schedules can help it? How can we present the right norm of behaviour that actually what we do in Fife or what we do in Edinburgh or what we do in the Outer Hebrides is to recycle? So I think it's not easy, to answer your point, but we have a tool that the government is pushing forward to enable us to understand what all the different steps are to make that happen. And values forms a key part of it, and legislation forms a key part of it, and presenting norms and other comms forms a key part of it.
So Pamela McLean, following on.
Just pick up on that last one first. Totally agree. The holistic view. I'm very proud to live in Stirling, where we're now recycling food waste on a weekly basis, and it's just, you know, exciting to see that everybody, as Alex says, it's the normal thing to do. You put your bin out. And there are places where people don't, but increasingly that social pressure is taking over. What I was signaling for before, though, is I wanted to pick up on how local authorities and local governance, I feel, is very important to longer-term lasting change. And I think it addresses, too, Claudia Beamish, what you were asking about community ownership. Do people actually need to physically own something? I'm not sure, but I think that if people become citizens in their local government, in their local authority, and feel that they have a say in what policies that local authority takes forward, they then start to gain an ownership. And I think that helps people, like I am proud to be in Stirling, because we're doing something together. Okay.
Some of us would like to think that we did have local government, but that's a big subject for another day. We have regional government, as far as I'm concerned, you know, which is abnormal in the extreme in the problems that people have in associating with such large councils. And, you know, there's a whole area in there which has to be addressed as well. Louise MacDonald, and then...
Noting your point there, Chair, I was actually going to reflect very clearly as well about the role of local government and its fundamental kind of purpose. But I suppose and recognising the role that public bodies as a whole and local government has to play, and there's a lot of work going on. But it's worth noting that this morning the Scottish Sustainable Network have just published their report into local government and this agenda, and actually overall it's an improving picture. And Chair, you'll also be delighted to know that the Highland Environment Network is one of the case studies that they've highlighted as good practice of partnership working, community working, and so on. So for me, that kind of role of local government, that local dimension to it, this is happening on doorsteps and in communities, can't be overlooked, and the important role that public bodies and local government has to play is a really important one.
I'm very pleased to hear that, because there are so many different conditions and situations in what are very large councils that have to be taken into account. And there's some sad one-size-fits-all arrangements that are made by councils, unfortunately. Graham Day has a point that follows on from this, and then we'll bring in Jim Hughes.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. It's absolutely heartening to hear about how effectively we're educating our young people. And that chimes absolutely with my own experience as a constituency MSP. But in terms of communicating the appropriate message or messages to the older generations, is the traditional media, TV, radio, newspapers, a force for good as we try to secure behavioural change, or a hindrance? Let me follow Jane Baxter's lead in declaring an interest. I was a journalist in a previous life, and I'm thinking about Jane's point about recycling, because I can envisage media coverage of that whole process being focused on people complaining about having 4 bins as opposed to explaining to them the need for having 4 bins. And I just wonder what your experience of using the media has been to communicate the messages.
But Morag Watson wants to start anyway, right?
Sorry, I thought Jim was...
Jim is going... Well, is it...
Well, I could just put in it's just a small contribution on part of what people have said, and it's not a direct question, so it might be quite useful just to
media
throw that through this in, and it's something that's used in marketing, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And see, some people understand
and applies.
Well, it does apply. It applies very much to farming. The bottom quadrant of that hierarchy, it's a triangle, is safety, and I think that's maybe perhaps the motivation that motivates farmers and declare an interest of farming interest as well from the borders, as everybody knows here, I think, that the motivation to could be funds so that you can pay the banker his dues and keep that farm in your actual ownership and do what you're brought up to do, and it's basically keeping the roof over your head. The second hierarchy is social. That's where, when you're already happy in your home, you've got your home secured, then you look perhaps to community, etc., and be part of something. The third quadrant up that triangle is esteem, and that's maybe where you go to Harvey Nicks, as who never quite understand that. And the very top one is maybe is called self-actualization, and that's maybe where Morag's example of those bankers they've got their home, they've got their social circles, they've got their esteem, they've got their fancy car or holidays, etc., and they're looking to find themselves and do a greater good because they don't have to actually worry about money. So I suppose behavioural change, you could actually look at all those 4 quadrants as marketers do and hone those to messages for in individuals. So I'll leave it at that.
And talking about the messages, Graham's question about, you know, what is the response of the public media, an interesting area for us to reflect whether in fact the different segments in society are being catered for. Morag Watson first.
Well, Maslow's hierarchy obviously features a lot in the work that we do, but it's an interesting model in that it is shown as quite a linear thing, and actually research shows that it's not a linear progression at all. We do move about it. But coming back to Graham's question about the media, from the work that we've done, and as other people have said, values and attitudes are very important in how people react around the behaviours and these things. There seems to be 6 major determinants of our values and attitudes, of which one is media. The others are family, as you might expect, and your peer group, your education, which we've already touched on. Actually, the economic model that your government pursues is quite a powerful one, as is the policy context of the country in which you live. So, as I've already said, we're doing a lot around education of our young people. We've already heard about various things that are happening around peer groups and so on. There's a great debate to be had about the economic model that we have and the prominence that's given to GDP, but you've had Nobel Prize winners in here to talk about that, so I won't touch on that one today. So focusing in on the media. What we do know is that messages that are to do with fear and threat have a tendency to cause people to reorientate towards money. If people feel threatened, they will worry about their security, and those messages have been found to be unhelpful. And as some of you will know, I have recently moved to Learning for Sustainability Scotland. I was previously with WWF, and the work around this started with us questioning the messages that we were given. And a lot of messages around climate change are inherently threatening. And it would seem that we are maybe undermining people's willingness to work on this issue by continually doing those messages. There's also a big body of work being done around media and the role of advertising. As we said, values are very important, and people have talked about the intrinsic and the extrinsic, and a great deal of the extrinsic messages to do with our status, our image and our wealth come to us via advertising. And there is a growing movement of people who are questioning the ubiquity of advertising in our society and the fact that as free citizens we cannot opt out of it. You cannot go anywhere other than into the remote highlands, and if you do so, you are probably wearing outfits that probably had advertising logos on them somewhere in order to survive. So if someone was asking me in terms of the media, what was one thing we could do, and although we've said there's never one answer, I would suggest that we look to the example of Sweden, Norway, and I believe it's Ontario, who have banned advertising to under 12s. If we want to do something for our young people, growing up in an environment where you're constantly being encouraged to want more and to want things, when, as Lou has very clearly said, when you ask young people, they don't want things, they want time, they want to be with people, they want relationships, and they want connection. I would defer to the knowledge of Professor Tim Kasser on that one and his excellent work of the high price of materialism, of the terrible impact that that has on young people. And the European Union has put in place a legislative framework around advertising to young people, but sadly it's not one that's been taken up widely in this agenda of how we begin to make the cultural shift or in terms of young people's well-being generally.
But do the media reflect your projects that you're talking about? Does the media reflect any of this?
Do you want me to pick up on that one before going to others?
Just while we're talking about it, yeah. And then Alex.
It's an interesting one. We have, when you look across the media and how prominent these issues become in the media, it has increased over time. But through Common Cause, we also did a very interesting piece of work looking at how often in the media people are referred to as citizens and how often they're referred to as consumers. And what you find is the level of which we are referred to as citizens has stayed pretty much steady. The amount that we are referred to as consumers has increased. So we are having this cultural norm of being encouraged to think of ourselves as people who buy stuff. That is the description of an individual. And, you know, as someone pointed out, if a government wants a public to be interested in politics, don't describe them as consumers. As consumers, you go into a shop and you expect a service. You don't expect a say in how the shop is run. As a citizen, we expect a say in how our country is run. So it sounds like a subtle thing, but a lot of the linguistic work has been done is words are not just words. They have a very powerful psychological effect. There's a big body of work that we've done around this, which is referred to as framing. And the way arguments are framed has a very profound impact on how people will react to them. So the words matter, and it makes a big difference between referring to someone as a citizen and referring to someone as a consumer.
Dick Lyle wanted to make a wee point about that, and then Alex.
Thank you, Kevin. It's actually on the very point of media. Story in the Daily Express, 21st of September. Global warming lobby has got it completely wrong. And it then goes on in the whole story to say that, you know, we're no, the change in climate change is not happening, and so that this is the mixed message that people are getting. You know, you lift your paper. You know, if you're a Daily Express reader, oh, I'll leave the lights on. The ice is no melting. The polar bears are not falling off the edge of the iceberg. You know, everyone said, and I think a classic one. I think we should issue. I think there was a film a couple of months ago. Always refer to films in this committee. The Day After Tomorrow, which showed the way that the world would go because of climate change and what happened on that particular film. But as I say, the point I'm making, and Graham was saying it earlier, is that the media have a lot of responsibility in order to also help all of us educate people. And they're failing at it because they're coming out with these mixed messages and not telling what they say as people. I won't read the whole of this article, you know, but as I say, there's some actually damning statements in it which I certainly don't agree with. And I think, as I say, the media has to also help us. How do we get the media to help us to improve the message we want to get out to the local citizen or consumer?
Can I just make a comment on that so that we can put it aside and bear it in mind? Will Hutton in the Observer on Sunday is talking about, for our planet's sake, we must trust scientific truth and collective action. And the subset is, sceptics will rubbish the new report on climate change this week, dismissing calls for government action. He says, ignore them. The difficulty for most people is that they find it very difficult with the media, and I think we may want to get other points of view in that in due course about whether they have the tools to ignore the nonsense that Dick has so aptly expressed there. Alex?
Yeah. I mean, it was very much building on that point in response to Graham's comment. Is the media a source for good, I think, is what you said in relation to this issue. I think the media's, I mean, the ISM, I keep talking about the ISM too, but one of the key elements within the social part of the ISM tool is the opinion leader. So I think is examine your opinion leaders. What are your opinion leaders saying? How can you influence those opinion leaders? And the media, in some respects, is no different from any other key opinion leader. It's on everybody's doorsteps in the morning. If everybody gets the papers in the morning these days, it's in their televisions every night. And if the media is sending out a message that is harmful to our agenda, then that's clearly a problem. We need to engage with the media around that. You commented, I think, that there's always going to be a problem. It's quite easy for them to be negative stories around these issues. I mean, I suppose it's just about all of us as local authorities, as stakeholders, community groups, organisations, businesses, politicians. We all need to make sure that we are intelligent enough to send the right messages, to put out the right values. But in the context of something like, I guess, recycling and waste, refuse collection, we were talking about a moment ago, There were lots of bad media stories when the waste collections went down to 2 weekly. Every time, oh, my bin's full of stuff, you know, oh, it's overflowing, we need to complain. But actually, we could, you know, there was always going to be some element of that, and the media are always ready to tell that bad news stories. But actually, we can push the positive side of things. There's always a positive message. Actually, if you recycle your food waste in your food waste bin, you never have a smelly bin. Okay? Your general waste bin doesn't smell, because all the smelly stuff is in your food waste bin. And it's simple, and it's a great story. And actually get that sort of discussion, that sort of story in the soap operas, in, you know, I don't know how we work with the media to do that, but those are the kind of messages. There's always a positive story. How can there not be a positive story when we're talking about this agenda? There has to be one, and there has to be a positive story that's relevant to the individual, and there has to be a positive story that's relevant to the kind of the global perspective. So I think there's always a way. There's just the media are a source of information. I think that's the way to view them, is to make sure that they give the right information in the right way and framed in the right way.
Very good. Louise was next, yes.
Just again, I think just building on that point about media, I'm like Graham, have to admit I'm a former tabloid journalist as well. And I used to probably write headlines like that, Richard, actually. So aspects of the kind of media I think are really interesting. I think there's a couple of points I'd want to make. One is recognising that actually the media is more than just information. Actually, it's a powerful social norming tool. And so recognising and trying to harness the value of that, I think, is incredibly important. Second point I'd want to make is about how you define media, because I think there are no doubt many other committees looking at the changing face of media and so on, so we don't need to rehearse that here. But actually the changing face of media, how some of the ways that people are accessing information, news, content, getting involved in things, whether that's online, offline in their communities and so on. We've talked about citizen science and so on, but equally in terms of the role of how people are connecting with information now is changing. And is there an opportunity to look at that change and say, how can we influence that? And the other bit would be around the powerful role of local media in this as well, is actually I think local newspapers or local media outlets are often overlooked in this conversation, because we immediately look to the Daily Expresses and the Daily Mails. But actually most people are reading their local news. That's actually where most people are getting their information from. It's their local news. And my final point on that comes back to some of the messaging that we know that works, is that leadership, but leaders, however you may view that, and consistent messages publicly are really, really important. So, people actually saying, whether it is that kind of example at a local level, everyone kind of saying the same thing. Actually, no, this is a good thing. The answer is this, and that consistency, and often repeated, helps to actually take that through. So I think I would see it's about working with the media rather than against them, and I would think it's about recognising they're going through a sea change themselves. And so it's about actually seeing how we can work together on and find places and spaces for different voices to be heard and different examples to be showcased. But local, again, is key.
Both Ross and then Alex. Come in.
Just a short point about media. I mean, I think apocalyptic stories about climate change don't help either, because everybody just goes, what's the point? Another thing I would say, they do, people think, oh, bloody hell, look, all the methane's coming out of the Arctic in a minute, and it'll not really matter anyway, so we might as well enjoy ourselves, But the other thing is we have to emphasise the other positive aspects of what we're doing, i.e. social things. The fact that having less cars in the cities is a good thing, and it's whether it's helping the climate change or not, not sitting in traffic jams. There's loads of, having a wind farm on your farm's quite a cool thing to have anyway, it's great that you generate this electricity, So we have to not work, get too, I'm not a sceptic in any way, by the way, but I mean, the apocalyptic stories don't help either.
Alex,
if I could just continue that, because I think Louise made a very good point about local mail, local papers, which most local people read and from where they get their local knowledge. And I think we can do, perhaps, if I give a couple of very brief examples, we could do a lot more to help ourselves in terms of trying to get a positive message across. Using a local example, Dumfries and Galloway Council several years ago have tied their council taxpayers in for many years to pay for something called an eco-deco recycling plant, which put us right at the very top of recycling figures. Then a reinterpretation of some of the rules and regulations put that extremely expensive plant right at the bottom of recycling figures, and we now are going to introduce doorstep recycling. It's very hard to create a good news story out of that when, okay, it's the right thing to do, but it's, you know, it's very hard to make a good news story out of what's become a very, very expensive exercise. I also note that one of the 10 key behaviour areas talks about installing more energy efficient heating using condensing boilers. Well, the original, and I'm not sure what the current situation is, the original Scottish Government scheme for introducing central heating didn't include condensing boilers. So I do think we need to have a little bit more joined up thinking in all of this if we are to try to create the good news stories that it goes against every journalist, with two notable exceptions, natural instincts to write.
And followed by Pamela McLean.
I think, you know, I agree broadly with what everybody's saying about the media. The Daily Telegraph also had a pretty damning article that didn't help things. And I think we need to think when we're working with the media beyond creating good news stories. Yes, we need to do that, but again, towards this cultural shift that we need to make. And so that speaks to the other sorts of stories that are reported in the newspaper, not just the ones that relate to climate change or recycling or transport. Looking at what the media lauds as good. And quite often it is those things that promote extrinsic values of wealth, skinniness, and all of these other things that perhaps aren't the best way to promote good community living. And further, just briefly, I think alongside the media, we have to coordinate the actions that are taken with that, the actions that are implementations of policies, things that speak to what you said, Rob Gibson, about the truly local governance, ensuring that truly local governance is happening rather than local authorities that may be too large to connect with individuals. What does that individual small community want to do, and how does that get reported? And what weight is that given compared to a big splashy story about Wall Street or the City of London? Okay.
I could make a comment here about the appalling debates in local newspapers about renewable energy projects and the so-called community that's ignored about these, but that might be straying too far into the negative and depressing, but it's true. Local newspapers are a major focus, I would see, from what people have said, but they certainly need to be looking at citizen issues a good deal more than they do, and I don't think they like having that sort of thing introduced to them. Too many of the editors are not of a view to think about citizens and more about consumers, and you can see that often from the kinds of syndicated columns that they have in the papers, etc. But anyway, we will explore this with other panels just now, because I think the way in which we spread the message and the media's approach to it is going to be quite important psychologically. Graham Day wanted to move on to
thank you.
Engagement.
Alec Ferguson made reference to joined up thinking and joined up working, which is also really important. And I just wonder what the panel's experience is with regard to areas of the public sector, such as local authorities and NHS, and how high up their thought process carbon footprint is when it comes to making decisions, both minor and major.
Pete, please. Pete.
Just happy to get started on this, and again, going back to our experience as Nourish Scotland, working with City of Edinburgh Council and the NHS and the university, three pretty big organisations, each with tens of thousands of employees and big budgets. And it has been a slow process, but it's been very heartening to see those organisations actually working together. And a lot of the driver for the sustainable food work came from the work the City of Edinburgh did on their Sustainable Edinburgh 2020 vision, when a lot of citizens came back in response to their consultation and said, well, what about food? That's not in there. We want to see something about food in there. So that responsiveness, I think, was a very good example of local authority thinking, all right, we're doing something about a carbon footprint, we're keen on that, but we're actually listening to what people are saying and what's important. There've been doing similar work consulting on 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in Edinburgh. And I think there's been a significant change in local authorities, certainly in the last 15 or 20 years that I've seen, in terms of their awareness of these issues and their willingness to engage, you know, at scale with the issues. I think Fife, I mean, James Back's point, Fife made a huge transformation in about 10 years in its recycling achievements. It was phenomenal, and it was a combination of political will, a really good recycling manager, and then getting the infrastructure in place to make it work well. So I mean, I suppose our experience is it is very encouraging. I'd echo Rob's point, though, that we need civic action at different scales, and some of the very big local authorities also need to have subsidiary community action at scale within those, with budgets attached, that they can actually make some changes. But the things like Dundee's example of, you know, a plan to put solar panels on all the roofs in Dundee, great idea, actually. And I note Alex's point about you've got to take people with you, but we don't always need to know what's insulating our homes. We just need to know they're a lot warmer than they are. And I think if we can have these at-scale actions by local authorities, it'd be really helpful. And what I was saying about local authorities, it wasn't just building turbines, it was also buying wholesale electricity and becoming the retailer of choice for people in their local area.
Yeah, I suppose if competition in the energy market is something that's very topical, it'd be interesting to see local authorities taking on that role. Morag, yeah, no?
Sorry, no, I think Kerry.
Sorry, Kerry was next.
We do quite a lot of work across Scotland with local authorities and with health authorities, and we find that it's relatively easy to engage both of those sectors with carbon reduction if there are other outcomes that are achieved by the projects we're proposing. So if that carbon reduction project is able to achieve community development or health or learning or skills development outcomes, it's quite an easy sell.
And we would need to measure this. Are you measuring what you're talking about?
We don't measure what we achieve in terms of carbon reduction. It may well be that Climate Challenge Fund participants are doing that when they're achieving other outcomes in relation to community capacity building and increasing engagement as well. I would imagine they are.
Jane wanted to say something.
Convener, I think it was Pete who said earlier about the value that's attributed to some of these things. I'm certainly very aware that in Fife there's lots of community gardens. Some of them are run by mental health organisations, some of them are run by local community groups. So people are growing food and getting some time and space to reflect on their experiences. And those are very good projects, but they can't get funding because it's just a garden. And the value of what they're doing doesn't seem to be able to be factored into either funding organisations or indeed the local authorities. So I think there's some work to do about what we value. It's been said before, but particularly in local government context, I think we're not very good at looking at the broader values when we look at what we want to do.
Fair point there. No further comments on that. Any further questions just at the moment? Because if there's... Yes, Pete. Yeah.
To Jane on that, I think you're absolutely right, and we're still at an early stage of things like the Global Carbon Disclosure Project to try and get cities globally benchmarking their emissions, and I think if we can develop better ways of measuring that in Scotland that includes not just carbon but also some natural capital and our food sustainability, then I think we can make... If we don't measure it, then it is very hard for local authorities to place a value on it. If we can start to work with our universities to find ways of measuring those things so that we can benchmark what we're doing and we can see progress over time much more clearly, then I think that will really help this scaling up of the process.
Louise?
Yeah, just reflecting on that, just in terms of kind of the local authorities and that kind of role of public bodies. I mean, I think the kind of the work that's been going on between COSLA and Scottish Government and others about refreshing that kind of work and that kind of focus around that is just to be very much welcomed. And I think it's from what I've seen, and certainly some of the conversations that we've been part of, that kind of move of taking it beyond the kind of the public duty, you know, around sustainability and so on, and actually taking it into that kind of perhaps more innovation, doing things differently, looking at kind of priority areas, thinking about some of the different ways that some of these issues can be tackled. Because I think some of the obvious things have been done or looked at, if you like, those kind of frontline things, but actually what else can be done. So I would hope that in the kind of the refresh of that approach between COSLA and Scottish Government and public bodies, that conversations like this can happen actually about you know, people getting the time to actually talk about what else can be done, because I think there's some brilliant commitment and enthusiasm across local authorities and public bodies, and we're in a position through our growing knowledge and understanding of these issues to really start to harness that. And so that ambition around Scotland and what we're seeking to achieve, I think, is driving people, and seeing how they can be part of that and driving that even further, I think has got huge potential. So I think for us all to be doing all we can to support that work.
That leads me on very helpfully, because I was going to ask people just in summary about how one thing that you talk about that you're promoting yourself, one thing that you should do that would add to the ability of the country as a whole to be in a better place in a couple of years' time, because I also think that this conversation needs to be shared with each of the other committees in this Parliament, because it actually impinges on everything that they do. So that's up to us to think how we do that. But if you, going round the table, if there are people who, in the context of this conversation, could apply one thing they think that we should be doing above all, even if it's a summary of what you've said before, it would be useful for us, I think, just to draw this to a conclusion in that sort of way. I see Alex scribbling there beautifully.
Oh, well, okay, you've prompted me, so I'll go for it. I suppose it was the one thing that, is it one thing we need to do? I don't know. It's, in the light of RPP2, the ISM model is stuck there in section 3.5, 6.5, wherever it is, where it's in the revised version, the latest version, it's there quite clearly, and it's very powerful. And obviously, it's been clear by what I've said that I very much buy into the approach. For me, it is happening. The Scottish Government are doing this to some extent, but I think the whole approach to RPP2 should have the ISM model at the front. RPP2 is inherently focused on the material, the policies, etc. But actually, let's make sure, if we can, next time we revisit it, or from tomorrow onwards, let's look at every single policy through the ISM lens. Let's understand what we need to do apart from just doing the policy. What do we need to do on the material level? What else do we need to do on the material level? What do we need to do on the social level? And what do we need to do on the individual level to make this the objective of this policy work?
Well, that's one thing we can possibly all buy into. Are there other things that you think are particularly one thing that, above all? Morag?
I can go next on this one. As several people have pointed out, it's the opening up of time and space to have these kind of conversations, and you know, I'm very glad to hear you saying that you think this conversation should be happening with your parliamentary colleagues. So we have mechanisms through the SSN, through the work that a lot of us have been doing with the Scottish Government's climate change team. Pam has been doing work here in the Parliament with the parliamentary body. We have the expertise of people who can lead these conversations. What we're looking for is the cultural shift of people actually giving this some priority. As Lou could tell you, when we came to people about the natural change process and said, can we have 16 days of your time in 1 year to talk about probably the biggest challenge that humanity will ever face? A lot of people went, oh, I'm not sure I've got that much time. We don't give priority to it. And this is somewhere where government, the Parliament, local authorities and the leaders that Lou and others work with can take a leading role. Being a leader, not in terms of being an expert, but in terms of opening a door and saying, I will make this space, I will make this time, and I will use my authority to get my team here to begin to have these conversations. And when people look for a hard policy recommendation and we say, get everyone together for something that sounds like a nice chat, I can understand that culturally that's a rather different ask from what people are used to hearing. But in my experience, and I can see some of my colleagues nodding around the table, it is getting people together for that conversation that can be the key leverage point where culture begins to change.
Thank you. Ross, do you want to...
Well, I'll try not to get too philosophical about things. In terms of my industry, sharing information is really important. and good, reliable technical information, because Alex talked about this earlier, getting technical information that's reliable is really important, because a lot of people come around selling, for example, renewables. And if you jumped in with both feet, you could make some big mistakes. There's a lot of contradictory stuff. You've got solar panels and heat exchangers on a milk cooling system, for instance. And if you speak to somebody else, you find that's a complete waste of time. They're fighting one another. And all that sort of stuff. And farmers need to get good, reliable information, because you could make some mistakes. And it's part of the reason why I've not actually done very much with renewables yet, because it's such a rapidly evolving sector. And it's not the most important thing for farming to do in terms of climate change, but in terms of their economic, saving money and energy, saving carbon, they need a lot more information. And
good, thank you. Pamela?
I think picking up on that a little bit, and what Morag said, one size fits all, you said earlier. Really, we need to take note of that, and we need to work towards developing a new cultural view of ourselves, which will come from the ground up, really. You know, we need to be participative in defining this, and then we will address that one size doesn't fit all issue. We have lots of information out there, but sometimes it's not accessible. We need to know what people need, etc. There's lots of infrastructure going on. But I'll just echo what Morag said, is that we need to establish this time and space. And I think it's not just for communities, but also people in working environments, because these become micro communities for ourselves. And we need to develop a capability. Morag alluded to, there are a number of people who can lead these discussions, yes, but we need more of them, because as Pete said earlier, we don't have that much time. So the more people who can lead these sorts of discussions and conduct their work in this participative way, the quicker we will be able to move towards this new development of a new cultural view to ourselves, sorry.
At the philosophy level, I quite agree that that stacks up. Pete, Rich.
I agree entirely with the speakers. I think we do need more and better conversations, and one conversation needs to be held between farmers who need people to buy their food, communities who need to eat their food, and local authorities who need to enable some of that process to take place. So definitely more and better conversations. But one technical thing, at the risk of upsetting Morag, that I think might be a useful starting point. We've got the procurement bill just coming into Parliament. And what Nourish is recommending is that we start to integrate food procurement horizontally. In other words, we integrate food procurement across public bodies in a region, rather than what we do at the moment, which is integrate it vertically, so the NHS has one contract for bread, or one contract for milk, or one contract. Now, if we can do that, it starts to create a different sort of dialogue for change, because the public bodies come together in an area, they look at what food they're buying for the public plate, and they start to work strategically with farmers and their sector to say, how could we get that food onto public plate? Do we need to upskill our people who are cooking food, but so we can get low carbon food onto the public plate? And I think if we can benchmark the carbon footprint of public food, and we can help procurement people work together to reduce that, we'll get healthier food, we'll get more sustainable food, and we'll hit a lot of wins. And there's an opportunity with the procurement bill coming up to actually get that into public policy.
Thank you. Louise McDonald.
Yeah, I suppose, and just in reflecting on what Pete was saying there, I think actually that goes back to Alex's kind of point at the beginning here, is actually that in looking at these all of these kind of issues, you can actually use the ISM modelling to look at that, because actually looking at that material context, the social context, and then so I think that's just an illustration of actually where the practical use of the tool in terms of kind of policy would be fantastic. And I think perhaps even for this committee, you know, to undertake an ISM workshop might be quite an interesting kind of thing to do. I'd also be really interested, the point about leadership I think is incredibly important, and that's certainly in terms of one of the key tasks of the 2020 climate group, is really trying to how do you kind of pull that set leaders from across sectors together. But I think we do need more bold leadership, and from in Parliament, at local government, and across all sectors. And that's certainly what we've heard from young people in the research that we've done. A sense that you've been telling us this is a problem for years and years. Why haven't you fixed it? Be bold. And so for me, there's recognising that. I think my last point, though, and I think this is, when I was kind of reflecting on all of this, and quite a lot of these discussions are technical and so on, but also then a lot of the discussion, because of where we are, is around policy and instruments and what can we use, but also we're hearing a lot about people and who we are as people and who we are as human beings and how complex a relationship that is. One of the things I learned from participating in the Natural Change programme is actually the fundamental is our disconnect with nature and our understanding of how that balance. And if you don't think that's true, I've got a friend of mine who says, if you don't think that's true, try holding your breath for 20 minutes. Okay, it's true. So for me, actually really trying to think about in all of this, going back to the source and exploring in more detail, rather than just talking about it in technical terms and about infrastructure and so on, actually recognising where this comes from. The source of this issue is about our kind of disconnect with nature. So how can we start to rebalance that? And that speaks to issues about the soil, and understanding good soil makes for a good life. So I think that brings it round for me.
Thank you. Kerry?
Thank you for the link to connectedness to nature. That's something that across the environmental sector we really know, because there's been quite a lot of research done, affects behavioural change. So connectedness to nature, I think, is really important. But before Louise mentioned that, I was thinking about how important it is to carry on facilitating local community values-based action which achieves carbon reduction alongside other social outcomes. And Climate Challenge Fund already does this, but there are quite a lot of communities of interest, of experience, of location that can't participate in Climate Challenge Fund. So I think there is both a need to keep going with Climate Challenge Fund, but also find other ways in which communities can take part in this activity. Those kind of activities mean that we're creating that space at a local level for people to think about their values. It is about, as Pam said, developing that kind of ground-up view of ourselves and the things that we hold as of value in our own communities. And it's positive because it's about achieving those reductions at the same time as doing things that are good for us locally, and things that we believe in. So I think sharing good practice and continuing to build that kind of community-based practice is really important.
Thank you all for your participation. It's certainly something which we're going to read and reflect on ourselves with interest as we move next week to discuss evidence session with Walter Stahl on resource use and circular economy issues, and evidence sessions with stakeholders on the budget and the rural broadband issues and on flood protection and alleviation, which follow on from our own work. But we'll be continuing with these trains of thought that you've helped us with, and I'd like to thank you very much for that. We'll have an absolute 5-minute break back at 1:45 in private. This ends the public part of the meeting. Thank you.